All right, so what we're going to do is take a very close look at the era of good feelings. And this is going to kind of set you up for the essay that you're going to be writing later this week. At this point, I'm not sure which day you're going to do it, but it could be tomorrow or perhaps the next day. All right, so we're going to talk about the rising nationalism, and we're really going to be evaluating the extent that the era of good feelings was truly an era of good feelings. All right, so when we look at this political map, you can see that much of the nation is actually under the control of Democrat Republicans. The Federalists in the election of 1816 had a very small degree of support, only in the Northeast, much like John Adams had with his unsuccessful run for a second term. So that's one of the reasons why it's considered an era of good feelings, is that there's seemingly a degree of political unity. So enter President Monroe. He continued what's sometimes called the Virginia dynasty, because so many of our early presidents were from Virginia. Washington, Jefferson, and now Monroe, or I'm sorry, Madison as well, and now Monroe. He chose government officials from all areas of the nation and also from both parties. The Federalists are essentially dead, but there's still people calling themselves Federalists, and he chose some of them to work in his cabinet. He created this vibrant nationalism for a short period because everybody was so unified. And he actually took a goodwill tour of the nation in 1818 and was welcomed by everybody. And so there's a picture of Mr. Monroe there. All right, so as I said, this is going to lead to the essential death of the Federalist Party. Not really going to hear much from them anymore, and they truly have not been relevant since John Adams was voted out of office. The only real thing that the Federalists have going for them is John Marshall still sitting on the Supreme Court. And the Federalists had a lot of problems, including the disloyalty during the War of 1812, the Hartford Convention that you've already learned about. They were extremely sectional regarding their interests, and they often came across with the appearance of not caring about the nation as a whole. And Jefferson had adopted many of their most important ideas. If you recall, when he became president, he really did not undo the Federalist agenda. He didn't do much to attack Hamilton's plan. He left the Bank of the United States largely in place, even though it did expire in 1811 naturally. Jefferson did nothing to kill it. So those were factors that helped the Federalists kind of disappear from the map. So the title, The Era of Good Feelings, is somewhat a misnomer because there's very, very serious issues going on that are going to divide the nation. Right? Many of these issues we discussed a little bit near the end of last week, but to better set you up for your essays, we want to kind of view them in the questioning way. Is it really an era of good feelings? Okay, so we have the Second Bank of the United States, and there's some constitutional questions with this. The Constitution does not give the federal government the power to create a centralized bank, and so that's going to create a lot of issues. The tariff of 1816, it was good for the economy in some ways, it was bad for the economy in some ways, and so it's going to be another divisive issue. The Great Triumvirate, three great political leaders of the day. Some of them vie for the presidency at some point, but they largely dominate in Congress, some of them for decades. There's questions over internal improvements, things like roads and canals. Is it constitutional for the government for the federal government to be involved in the creation of these things? The Panic of 1819, which was largely, in the view of some people, caused by the Second Bank of the United States. When you see that bus there, that means Bank of the United States. A lot of people blame it for the Panic of 1819. Western expansion, the Missouri Compromise, other very divisive issues, despite being known as the era of good feelings. All right, so we're going to go through these kind of step by step. The Second Bank of the United States was supported by the same Democrat Republicans who had opposed the First Bank of the United States, and that kind of goes back to the shift of the party. That was led more or less by Jefferson. He did nothing to kill the bank, and so the Democrat Republicans largely absorbed that policy of accepting it. And during the War of 1812, the United States experienced severe inflation and had difficulty paying for the military. During the war, as we discussed last week, you have some of the same old problems. We had a military that was not really prepared to go to war, much like the American War for Independence. We won largely because of the difficulties the British faced in fighting overseas, not really based on much of our military prowess. Our key victory at New Orleans actually happened after the treaty had been ratified. So we had a lot of trouble paying for the military during the War of 1812. As a result, Madison and Congress agreed to charter the bank for 20 years. So it's going to be recreated now, the second bank of the United States. So we'll have a very interesting story later of how it's going to be killed off. You know, the first bank of the United States just essentially went away when the charter lapsed. This one's going to have a 20-year charter from Congress. All right, so we get to the Tariff of 1816, and it was created to protect U.S. manufacturing from British competition. Now, this U.S. manufacturing that we're now talking about really did not exist much before the embargo of 1807. The embargo of 1807 that was put in place by President Jefferson forced America to create more of a manufacturing base, more of a shift from just being a largely agrarian economy to getting into more manufacturing. And much of that is going to happen in the New England area. Okay, so now that we're at the end of the War of 1812, there's a lot of concern. Okay, after the war, Britain had all these goods sitting around that they had no market for, and they flooded the United States with cheap goods, often sometimes below cost to undercut new U.S. industries. This is one of the arguments. You know, some of you struggle with synthesis. This is one of the arguments that we now have in our global economy with Chinese manufacturing. It's cheaper to manufacture in China. They do not have all the environmental regulations that we have. Their wages are lower, and sometimes we even accuse their government of subsidizing production costs. So a lot of goods come into America from China, and they can come here at a lower cost. Same issue here leading up to the Tariff of 1816. British goods coming into the country, and they're coming in much cheaper. All right, and so you can see kind of an economic example up here, the difference in production cost. Obviously, the British are going to have an upper hand when it comes to manufacturing. That's going to hurt the new emerging American manufacturing base, and that's what's going to really lead to the tariff. All right, so the Tariff of 1816 is going to be the first protective tariff in United States history, and it is going to impose 20 to 25% duties or taxes on those imports. And of course, the purpose of doing that, not only does it make revenue for the government, it pushes the cost of those items higher and encourages you to buy your own domestic goods. Unfortunately, because of the advances of British technology, they were just really good at manufacturing, and we were still infants at it. The tariff wound up not really being high enough to provide effective protection for American production. All right, so this tariff, it is the first one, and this is going to start a protective trend in United States trade that's actually going to last for about 100 years until the United States created an income tax. At that point, we back away from tariffs a bit, but they wound up being a contributing factor to the Great Depression. But once the federal government in 1916 had the amendment that allowed the income tax, they no longer need to rely on tariffs for income for the government, and they're going to start to back away from that idea. Now we're in an era of free trade where we have very few tariffs on foreign goods. All right, so now we move on to the Great Triumvirate, and the first member of the Great Triumvirate was Henry Clay from Kentucky. He represented the West. He had been a war hawk in 1812. He was a very strong nationalist, and he saw tariffs as a way to develop a strong domestic market. Basically, if we can restrict the foreign goods coming in, we can help our own markets emerge. He believed that Eastern trade would flourish under tariff protection, and certainly, even though he was from the West, he thought that it would benefit multiple parts of the country. He hoped that tariff revenues would fund roads and canals in the West, especially in the Ohio Valley, closer to his region. The next member of the Great Triumvirate is John C. Calhoun from South Carolina, and he represents Southern views. And like Clay, he was a war hawk and a strong nationalist. He initially supported the tariff and then later claimed that it enriched New England manufacturers at the expense of the South. And we made reference to this last week and how some of the politicians of the day would flip-flop on their views, just like modern politicians do. John C. Calhoun flip-flopped on this. He originally supported the tariff, and then he later did not. And there's a picture of Mr. Calhoun there. He is going to come up quite a bit over the coming weeks. His name will. And Daniel Webster, who is from New Hampshire. He's obviously representing northern views, specifically the Northeast. He was opposed to the tariff because he feared that it would damage the shipping industry. And of course, in New England, those are your great shippers in young America. And he wants to protect their ability to ship goods. And they didn't care whose goods they were shipping, whether they were foreign or domestic. That was their slice of the pie, and he wanted to protect that. And so at this point, it was largely because New England was not completely industrialized yet, and so that's why he took the view that he did. All right, now let's talk about the Panic of 1819. One of the themes that we'll bring up later is the fact that roughly every 20 to 30 years from early America all the way up to the Great Depression, we have a severe depression. Back then, they're called panics. Now we refer to them as depressions. So this was the first financial panic since the critical period of the 1780s under the Articles of Confederation. And we had a lot of difficulty in that era with our economy, and the Articles of Confederation government essentially had no power to deal with that. So we see panics moving forward. You're going to see them in 1819, 1837, 1857, 1873, 1893, 1907, 1929, on and on and on. An interesting thing, just since you've all taken economics, is that the Federal Reserve created, I want to say in 1916, it had very little power, and then the government gave the Federal Reserve much more power around 1931. We've not had any depression since then. We've had a lot of recessions. We've had one great recession recently, but we've had no more depressions, which kind of speaks to the ability of the idea that these centralized banks can kind of control the chaos. All right, so the Panic of 1819. Here's the causes of the panic. There was over-speculation on frontier lands because the Bank of the United States forced the Western banks, the small banks, the private and state banks, they were forced to foreclose on farms. And the reason why is rather interesting. The Bank of the United States stopped allowing payment in paper, and they demanded payment in specie. And there was a very, very limited amount of specie, very limited. So the state banks that were affected, they called in their loans, and many farmers simply did not have specie. They had paper money. The problem with the paper money is that throughout American history, there was basically, at times, there was up to 30,000 different types of paper money being issued. It was being issued by drugstores. It was being issued by state banks, state governments, by cities. Everybody you could imagine was issuing paper, and it was creating too much turmoil in the economy. Obviously, counterfeiting was much easier. So that's one of the main reasons why the bank did not want paper money to repay loans. They wanted specie. So this is going to lead to a lot of farmers losing their farms. The results of this panic is that many in the West begin to view the bank as an evil financial monster. It had caused their problems. It was hard on the poor classes looking for a more responsive government. There's going to be new land legislation resulting in smaller parcels being sold for lower prices, and a widespread sentiment to end the practice of imprisoning debtors. And we glossed over a little bit of this last week. All right, so I'm going to stop this because I only get 15 minutes for these videos, and then we will start all over and complete